An old black woman enters the courthouse. A bailiff decides to make an example of her. He just made the biggest mistake of his life, because she is the judge who will decide his fate. The cold Boston rain fell in a relentless, unforgiving drizzle, clinging to the granite facade of the John Adams courthouse and turning the morning sky the color of slate. It was the kind of weather that seeped into your bones, a damp chill that promised a long, trying day. It was just after 8 a.m. when Judge Anya Sharma stepped out of her modest sedan, the fabric of her worn but impeccably tailored wool trench coat doing its best to ward off the damp. At 65, she moved with a quiet deliberation that could be mistaken for fragility, but was in fact the economy of motion learned over a lifetime of battles fought in courtrooms and boardrooms long before she ever donned a robe. She clutched a simple, unadorned leather portfolio to her chest. It was worn at the corners, a testament to decades of use. Around her neck, almost completely hidden by the collar of her silk blouse, hung a delicate silver locket. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but inside it held a tiny, folded photograph of her late husband, his smile a silent source of strength she'd drawn on for nearly 20 years. She preferred to enter the courthouse this way, as Anya Sharma, citizen, not Judge Sharma, the federal authority. It was a habit from her days as a high-stakes civil rights attorney, a time when observing the terrain before revealing her position had won her seemingly impossible cases. Today, however, that quiet entry would be interpreted not as humility, but as weakness. As she approached the security checkpoint, Deputy Cade Maddox watched her, his eyes narrowing. Maddox was a man built of solid, unyielding angles, from his blocky shoulders to his severe crew cut. He was known for his rigid interpretation of the rules, especially when it suited him. He didn't recognize the woman, and that was all the reason he needed to dislike her. There was something in her posture, a calm, centered dignity, that felt like a challenge to the small kingdom he ruled inside the courthouse doors. "Ma'am," Maddox said, his voice a low growl. He stepped forward, deliberately blocking her path to the metal detector, his thick forearms crossed. "Gonna need you to step out of the line." Anya paused, her expression unreadable. She had faced down corporate lawyers, hostile witnesses, and prejudiced juries, her composure a shield. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone even. Maddox's eyes swept over her, a slow, insolent inventory. He noted the sensible, low-heeled shoes, the classic cut of the coat, the silver hair peeking from beneath her collar, and the deep, intelligent eyes that met his gaze without flinching. He didn't answer immediately. In his world, a woman like this, black, older, seemingly alone, was a target for a casual display of power. "No visible ID," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Can't just wander into a federal building looking out of place." Calmly, Anya reached into her coat, retrieved her wallet, and produced her federal judicial credentials. The golden eagle on the badge gleamed under the flat, fluorescent light. Maddox took the ID from her hand but barely glanced at it. He slipped it into his breast pocket with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "I'll need that back," Anya said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the unshakable firmness of a command. He took a half-step closer, invading her personal space. A faint, sour smell of stale coffee hung about him. "In a hurry to get somewhere, Grandma?" The word was designed to diminish, to infantilize. It landed with the sting of a slap. A few feet away, a younger female guard, whose name tag read Chloe, shifted her weight nervously. She saw the interaction, her brow furrowing with concern, but she remained silent, a statue of inaction. "I have a hearing to preside over," Anya stated, her back straightening as much as her years would allow. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Maddox snapped, his authority now fully asserted. "And that includes random secondary screenings. Let's go." Before she could protest further, he placed a heavy, proprietary hand on her upper arm, steering her away from the main line and toward a solid, windowless door off to the side. The door closed behind them with a heavy, final-sounding click, plunging them into a sterile silence broken only by the hum of an aging ventilation unit. The trap was set. The screening room was a cold, sterile box, designed for intimidation. The walls were painted a lifeless, institutional beige, and the air was thick with the faint, astringent smell of industrial cleaner. A single steel chair, bolted to the linoleum floor, sat in the center of the room under the glare of a single, mercilessly bright light panel. On a small metal trolley nearby lay the tools of the trade, a handheld scanning wand, latex gloves, and, ominously, a set of heavy-duty electric clippers with multiple guards. "I do not consent to this search," Anya said, her voice clear and steady. She stood her ground, her portfolio held like a shield. "You have no probable cause to detain me." "My cause is your acting suspicious," Maddox retorted, his lips twisting into a sneer. He gestured dismissively toward the chair with a thumb. "That's all the cause I need. Sit down." When she didn't move, he gave a sharp nod. The door opened and two more bailiffs entered, flanking him. The young female guard, Chloe, remained outside, her face a mask of anxious indecision visible for a moment through the closing door. One of the men grabbed Anya's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. The other pulled the chair out with a metallic scrape against the floor. "This is an assault. I am requesting your names and badge numbers," Anya said, her voice rising slightly, not with fear, but with righteous indignation. Maddox ignored her. Instead, he walked to the trolley and picked up the electric clippers. The coiled black cord dangled like a dead snake. "What do you think you're doing with that?" she demanded, a genuine flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "Standard protocol," he lied smoothly, his expression smug. He gestured toward her head with the clippers. "Could be hiding anything in that silver mop of yours." Her hair. It was more than just hair. After a lifetime of conforming to the severe, practical styles demanded by a world that judged women on their appearance, she had finally let it grow out upon taking the bench. Her silver locks, twisted into an elegant crown, were a symbol of her freedom, a quiet declaration of her identity beyond her profession. It was her personal flag of victory. The clippers buzzed to life, a vicious, angry sound that filled the small room. Before Anya could fully process the intent behind the threat, she felt the cold, vibrating metal teeth against her scalp. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Years as a civil rights lawyer, facing down hatred in dusty southern towns, had taught her to compartmentalize, to transform violation into fuel. She sat rigid in the chair, her eyes fixed on her own reflection in the polished surface of a fire extinguisher case on the opposite wall. She watched as silver coils, the product of years of patience and care, fell to the dirty linoleum floor. One by one, they dropped, piling up around her feet like fallen laurels. It was a methodical, unhurried desecration. Maddox worked with a detached cruelty, his movements efficient. He was stripping her of her dignity, strand by strand, and he was enjoying it. As he worked, she noticed his chest rig was positioned just so, the lapel of his uniform jacket conveniently obscuring the lens of his body camera. It wasn't an accident, it was a practiced art. When he finished, her head was a landscape of uneven patches and raw scalp. He blew a few stray hairs from his sleeve. "Should have shown a little more respect," he grunted, the clippers still buzzing in his hand before he shut them off, plunging the room back into a tense silence. Anya's voice, when it returned, was unnervingly steady, devoid of the tremor he expected. "You will live to regret this day." He leaned down, his face close to hers, the scent of his coffee breath washing over her. "People like you always say that," he sneered. He opened the door. "You're free to go. The courtroom is that way." She rose slowly, her movements stiff but deliberate. She reached into his breast pocket, retrieved her own ID, and walked out without another word. Her steps were even, her expression a blank mask. But inside her chest, a fire had been lit. It was a cold fire, burning hotter than rage and deeper than humiliation. It was the fire of purpose. The same purpose that had driven her through law school at an age when others were planning retirement, through every barrier society had ever placed in her path. She wasn't just a victim. She was a judge. And court was now in session. The hallway felt unnaturally long, a corridor of judgment where she was the one being judged. The air was thick with the silent, charged energy of averted gazes and sudden whispers that died the moment she looked over. Two clerks, huddled by a water cooler, went silent and became intensely interested in their shoes as she passed. A pair of lawyers, deep in conversation, stepped aside, their eyes widening with a mixture of shock and pity as they saw her shorn head. They had heard the confrontation, perhaps even seen her being led away. No one had intervened. Their silence was a form of complicity, another layer to the day's injustice. Down the corridor, the muted sounds of the courtroom filtered through the grand, oak double doors. It was a high-profile morning, a police misconduct hearing, United States v. Boston Police Department, a case stemming from a protest where several officers were accused of using excessive force. Her robe was waiting in her private chambers, her staff ready to brief her. That was the normal procedure. But today, normal was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stopped just outside the courtroom doors. She took a single, deep, centering breath, a technique she'd mastered during grueling, multi-day trials. Then, with a resolve that felt like steel solidifying in her spine, she pushed both doors open wide. The effect was instantaneous. The low hum of courtroom chatter was sliced in half, replaced by a sudden, collective intake of breath. Heads swiveled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Her shoes, sensible and quiet on the hallway carpet, now clicked with loud, authoritative raps against the polished terrazzo floor. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, a drumbeat marking her advance. She walked past the public gallery, past rows of journalists whose pens froze mid-scrawl, past the plaintiffs and their families, past the defense table where the uniformed officers sat with their smug-looking attorney. A wave of confusion rippled through the room, followed by a dawning, horrified recognition. The elderly black woman who had been publicly humiliated at the security checkpoint, the woman whose scalp bore the raw, butchered evidence of that humiliation, was not a defendant. She was not a witness. She was the Honorable Judge Anya Sharma. She didn't stop until she reached the judicial bench, the massive, carved wooden structure that symbolized the very authority she had just been denied. She ascended the 2 steps. Standing at the side door, his hand still resting on the handle, was Deputy Cade Maddox. His duty was to secure the courtroom. As Anya turned to face the room, her eyes swept over the crowd and landed directly on him. He went absolutely still, his face draining of all color. The casual arrogance of moments before evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed, primal fear. It was the look of a predator who, in a moment of carelessness, has found itself in the cage with a lion. Anya held his gaze for a beat longer, her expression calm, cold, and utterly dominant. She didn't flinch. Then, she turned away. With a single, deliberate movement, she reached for the black robe folded over her chair. She slipped it on, one arm at a time. The heavy fabric settled onto her shoulders like a familiar suit of armor, crafted for a different kind of war. She looked to the court clerk, a young man whose face was pale with shock. "Is the docket ready for review, Mr. Davies?" she asked, her voice perfectly level. "Why yes, Your Honor," the clerk stammered, his voice cracking. Anya nodded once. She lowered herself into the high-backed leather chair, the seat of power. The courtroom held its breath. The unmasking was complete. The Queen had taken her throne. "We will begin," Judge Sharma announced, her voice resonating with an authority that seemed to press down on the room, with preliminary testimony in Case 24, C-715, United States versus the Boston Police Department. She spoke as if nothing was out of the ordinary, as if the raw, uneven state of her hair was a new judicial fashion. The dissonance was staggering. The charges she read aloud, abuse of power, excessive force, and violation of civil rights, hung in the air, each one a direct echo of what she had just endured. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably. The defendants, 3 police officers, exchanged nervous glances. From the corner of her eye, Anya saw Cade Maddox, still frozen by the door. He looked like a man who had just realized the building was on fire and he was chained to the wall. He began to back away slowly, trying to melt into the shadows of the doorway, his hands twitching at his sides. He desperately wanted to disappear. He was right to. His moment was coming. Anya called the first witness, a protester whose arm had been broken by an officer's baton. She listened with intense focus, taking meticulous notes with her silver fountain pen, the scratching sound audible in the tense silence. She asked no questions. Not yet. She was letting the pressure build, allowing Maddox to stew in the toxic cocktail of his own panic. After the second witness had been cross-examined, she looked at the clock. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she declared. The courtroom emptied in a hurried, whispering exodus. Anya remained seated, her fingers steepled before her, watching as the room cleared. When only her clerk, 2 federal marshals she had personally requested, and a sweating Cade Maddox remained, she finally looked directly at him. Her gaze was like a physical force, pinning him in place. "Deputy Maddox," she said, her voice as sharp and clear as breaking glass. He stopped his retreat. "Yes, Your Honor." He forced himself to walk forward, each step looking like a painful march toward a cliff's edge. "State your full name and badge number for the record." "Cade Maddox, Your Honor." "Badge 713. "And how long have you served as a bailiff at this courthouse, Deputy?" 14 years, Your Honor." 14 years. She let the words hang in the air. She tapped her pen once against her legal pad. The sound was like a gunshot. "In those 14 years, Deputy Maddox, how many complaints for misconduct have been filed against you?" The remaining color drained from his face. His eyes darted toward the marshals, looking for an ally. He found none. "Your Honor, I didn't know who." "That was not my question," she cut him off, her voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register. "How many?" I'm not sure of the exact number, Your Honor." "I don't." 12, Anya interrupted, her voice precise, not loud. 12 formal complaints. I had my clerk pull the file during testimony. A complaint from a Ladings delivery driver you illegally detained for 2 hours for loitering. A complaint from a young Muslim woman you forced to remove her hijab in a public corridor. All of them. All buried. All dismissed with a note from your supervisor citing your proactive approach to security. His mouth trembled. He was coming apart at the seams. "I didn't know who you were," he finally blurted out, the pathetic core of his defense. "And that," she replied, leaning forward, the stillness of the room cracking under the weight of her words, "is the entire problem, isn't it? You thought I was a nobody. Just another elderly black woman you could bully, humiliate, and shave for sport, because you believe your badge gives you the right to decide who is worthy of dignity." The sound of handcuffs being unsnapped from a belt echoed in the room. "Because of you, this courthouse has been stained," she continued, her voice rising with controlled power. "Because of your actions, the sanctity of this court is in question. And because you assaulted a sitting federal judge in this very building, you are now the subject of a federal criminal investigation." She turned her gaze to the 2 stone-faced marshals standing by the exit. "Marshals, take Deputy Cade Maddox into custody. Formal charges will be filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office before the end of the day." The marshals moved with swift efficiency. "You can't do this," Maddox shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief and terror as the cold steel closed around his wrists. He was wrong. She already had. The arrest of a court's own bailiff sent a seismic shockwave through the building. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of fear, awe, and uncertainty. During a brief pause in the proceedings, the young female guard from the security checkpoint, Chloe, approached the bench. Her hands were trembling. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw what happened. This morning. With Deputy Maddox. I should have done something. I was scared. Anya studied the young woman for a long moment, seeing not an accomplice, but another victim of Maddox's culture of intimidation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for telling me now, Chloe. That takes courage. But I didn't stop it, the young woman lamented, tears welling in her eyes. No, Anya replied, her voice softening for the first time that day. But you are speaking up now. In this building, that is more than most are willing to do. Go back to your post. The moment of quiet humanity was shattered when the lead defense attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, rose to his feet. Your Honor, before we proceed, the defense would like to make a formal motion. Anya's eyes hardened. Proceed, Mr. Thorne. Given the recent developments this morning, specifically the arrest of a courthouse deputy following an interaction with Your Honor. You mean the arrest of the man who assaulted me in a screening room less than 2 hours ago, Anya clarified, her voice dangerously calm. Thorne swallowed, momentarily flustered. Yes, Your Honor. We believe these events may present a conflict of interest. There is now a reasonable question of judicial impartiality. We must formally request that you recuse yourself from this case. A dead silence fell over the courtroom. This was the counterattack. An attempt to use her own victimization against her. Anya Sharma stood up. She walked slowly to the very edge of the bench, resting her hands on the wood. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. You are suggesting, Counselor, that because I was the victim of a crime of bias and abuse of power, that I am no longer capable of presiding over a case about bias and abuse of power? I am suggesting that the perception of bias is enough to... Let me stop you right there, she interrupted, her voice carrying the full weight of her 65 years. I was publicly assaulted today. Not for anything I said, or anything I did. I was assaulted for who I am. Because a man in a position of authority saw an elderly black woman and decided she could not possibly hold power in this building. She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the room. And what did I do in response? I took my seat on this bench. I conducted this hearing. I have followed every rule, every statute, every code of conduct. You, Mr. Thorne, are the one asking me to deviate from my duty. Her voice grew stronger, a ringing indictment. You want to talk about the perception of bias? Let's talk about the reality of it. Real bias is a man using a badge and a set of clippers to strip a woman of her dignity. Real bias is a system that buries 12 formal complaints to protect one of its own. She pointed a single, steady finger toward the empty post where Cade Maddox had stood. That bias, she said, her voice dropping to a powerful near whisper, and the bias on trial in this very case, they spring from the same poisoned well. To recuse myself would not be an act of impartiality. It would be an act of surrender. It would be telling every person who has ever been diminished, ignored, or abused by someone in uniform that the system will ultimately protect itself over them. That will not happen in my courtroom. Not today. She returned to her chair. Motion denied, Mr. Thorne. Call your next witness. The final day of the hearing arrived with a palpable sense of history in the making. The gallery was packed. Reporters, civil rights attorneys from across the state, law students, they had all come to witness the conclusion of what was no longer just a police misconduct case. It was a reckoning. The prosecution's final witness was a retired court clerk named Maria Flores. A petite, nervous woman, she testified with a trembling voice about how former supervisors had instructed clerks to deprioritize complaints against certain bailiffs, including Cade Maddox, often dismissing them administratively with the tacit approval of a now-retired chief judge. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin, exposing the rot not just in one man, but in the system that enabled him. When it was time for the verdict, Judge Sharma walked to the bench in silence. She looked out over the packed courtroom, from the defense table to the prosecution, to the expectant faces in the gallery. Then, she did something no one expected. She took off her black judicial robe, folded it with meticulous care, and laid it across her chair. She stood before them shielded by nothing but the simple dress she wore, her presence defined not by a title, but by the person she was. Her shorn head, with its uneven patches of silver, was a stark crown of defiance. "I have sat behind this bench for years," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have worn the robe and carried the gavel. But I have also, at times, stayed silent when I should have spoken. Today, I am done being quiet." She looked at the three officers at the defense table. "This court finds the evidence presented to be credible and overwhelming. This court finds the defendants guilty of all charges." A wave of gasps and applause rippled through the gallery, which she silenced with a raised hand. But it does not stop there. She stepped forward from behind the bench. "This court also finds that the institutional culture of this courthouse enabled these actions. Therefore, I am recommending an immediate, independent review of every complaint filed against security personnel in this district for the past decade, and a formal investigation into any official who suppressed them." She then reached for a folder that had been sitting on her desk. "This, however, is not a recommendation. It is a policy directive, effective immediately under my authority as a senior judge of this district." Her voice never wavered. "It is called the Sharma Mandate. It requires comprehensive, mandatory anti-bias and de-escalation training for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse personnel. It mandates regular, randomized psychological screenings. And it establishes a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with complaints handled by an independent civilian oversight board." She held the folder up. "I will take this to the circuit, to the judicial conference, to the Senate if I have to. Because what happened to me in the hallway of my own courthouse should never, ever happen to anyone again." The side door opened, and Cade Maddox was led in, cuffed and in a prison jumpsuit. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out despair. Anya faced him directly. "Mr. Maddox, this court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law for assault and deprivation of rights under color of law. You spent a career deciding who was worthy of dignity. You thought your badge made you immune. You were wrong." She nodded to the marshals. "Take him away." Months later, Judge Anya Sharma stood before a lecture hall of law students at Boston College. Her hair had begun to grow back, a soft, even crown of silver sprouts. A young woman in the front row asked, "Judge, after everything you went through, do you still believe in the system?" Anya paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I don't believe in the system as it was," she said finally. "But I believe, with every fiber of my being, in what it can become. And it is our job, yours and mine, to build it." This story is a powerful reminder that true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about the courage to stand tall when the world tries to make you small, and to use your voice to forge a better future. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, please don't let its message end here. Share it with someone who needs to see that one person's courage can spark real change. Comment below with your own thoughts on justice and respect, because these conversations matter. And please, as we discuss, let's comment with respect for one another's experiences. Subscribe for more stories that don't just tell you what happened, but inspire you to think about what comes next.